The silence falls. The morning shift on Centauri Station began like any other, with the gentle hum of recycled air and the soft blue glow of status displays painting the corridors in familiar light. Senior Communications Officer Zarth of the Veltar Confederation checked her chronometer and prepared for the daily briefing with Earth's diplomatic corps. For 300 cycles, this routine had never varied. The humans were punctual to a fault, arriving precisely at 0800 station time with their characteristic blend of efficiency and that peculiar warmth they called humor. At 0801, Zarth's primary tentacle hovered over the communication array, waiting for the familiar ping that announced humanity's presence. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Her secondary hearts began their stress rhythm as she initiated the connection protocol. Static filled the channel where Ambassador Chen's voice should have been. Perhaps a technical malfunction, she whispered to herself in the clicking language of her people, but her bioluminescent patches flickered with uncertainty. Technical malfunctions were rare in human systems. They had built their networks with a redundancy that bordered on the obsessive, learned from centuries of their violent history where communication failures meant death. 3 decks below, in the sprawling marketplace that formed the station's commercial heart, Merchant Captain Thulgor was experiencing his own moment of confusion. His massive Korthak frame dominated the cargo bay as he waited for the weekly shipment from Luna Colony. The humans had never missed a delivery in 50 standard years of trade. Their lunar manufacturing facilities produced some of the finest precision instruments in known space, devices so perfectly calibrated that other species had stopped trying to compete. The cargo manifest glowed on his personal display, showing 20,000 units of quantum processors, medical scanners, and those peculiar human items they called comfort goods, coffee, chocolate, and various forms of entertainment media. The Korthak had initially dismissed these last items as frivolous, but they had become some of the most sought-after commodities in the outer sectors. Something about human creativity sparked desires in alien minds that their own cultures couldn't satisfy. When the expected transport window closed without so much as a navigation ping, Thulgor's tusks ground together in frustration. His thick hide rippled with the involuntary color changes that indicated deep stress. In 50 years of dealing with humans, he had learned to appreciate their reliability above all else. When they said a shipment would arrive, it arrived. When they promised a service, it was delivered. This silence was not merely unusual. It was unprecedented. The first formal alert came from the Galactic Communications Array, a massive installation that monitored subspace traffic across 12 sectors. Operator Third Class Nixon, a crystalline being whose entire existence revolved around the interpretation of energy patterns, noticed the anomaly during the routine evening analysis. The normal flow of human communications had simply ceased. No distress signals, no final transmissions, no panicked evacuation orders. The entire human communication network had gone silent simultaneously across every colony, every ship, every outpost in their vast interstellar domain. For a species that communicated with the frequency and intensity of humans, this silence was like watching a star simply wink out of existence. Nixon's crystal matrix flickered through the spectrum of confusion before settling on the deep purple of alarm. The being's report traveled up the chain of command with the speed that only genuine emergencies could achieve. Within 2 hours, the notice had reached the highest levels of the Galactic Council. On the Council station orbiting the neutron star Kepler 442, the emergency session convened in what humans would have called record time, though no humans were present to observe this historical irony. The Great Chamber, normally filled with the measured debate of representatives from 47 member species, crackled with tension and barely contained panic. Council Speaker Mordun, an ancient being whose species had achieved spaceflight when humans were still discovering fire, called the session to order with a gravity that seemed to bend the space around them. The eldest, as they were known, had overseen first contact protocols with 17 different species, but They had never encountered anything quite like this. Fellow representatives, more done began, their telepathic voice resonating through the universal translators in carefully modulated tones. We are faced with a situation unprecedented in recorded galactic history. The species known as humans have vanished without any detectable trace. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of voices, clicks, whistles, and electromagnetic pulses as each species processed this information according to their own cultural frameworks. The Zephyrians immediately began calculating the economic implications, their trader minds already adapting to new market conditions. The warrior caste of the Brahmakai saw potential opportunity in the power vacuum. The philosophical Etherians wondered about the metaphysical implications of an entire species simply ceasing to exist. But Ambassador Krelix of the Muntarun Collective raised an appendage for silence, and the respect commanded by their species' reputation for analytical precision brought immediate quiet to the chamber. The Muntaruns were known for their methodical approach to problem-solving, a trait that had served the Council well in previous crises. Before we speculate, Krelix stated with characteristic directness, we must establish facts. What do we know with certainty about the human disappearance? The report that followed painted a picture so strange that several representatives requested verification of the data multiple times. Every human colony, every ship, every outpost had gone silent at exactly the same moment, measured to within nanoseconds across distances that spanned hundreds of light years. No evidence of battle, no signs of evacuation, no distress signals. Simply silence, where once there had been the constant chatter of human civilization. More disturbing was what initial probe missions had discovered. Human colonies stood intact, their cities populated but motionless. Ships drifted in perfect formation through space, their systems functioning normally, but their crews absent from sensors. Agricultural worlds continued their harvests under automated systems, but no human hands guided the work. It was as if someone had reached across the galaxy and simply removed every human being while leaving everything else exactly as it had been. Dr. Velhan, the Altarian xenobiologist who had spent 3 decades studying human behavior, stood to address the assembly. Their multiple eyes focused independently as they processed the implications of the data they had helped compile. The humans were unique among galactic species, Velhan began, their translated voice carrying undertones of genuine loss. They were the only species to achieve interstellar capability despite having evolved from predators. Most sentient species evolved from prey animals, herd creatures, or symbiotic organisms. Humans came from apex predators, yet they developed cooperation, empathy, and altruism to a degree that surpassed most naturally peaceful species. A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. The human paradox had been a source of fascination for xenobiologists across the galaxy. How could a species capable of such violence also produce such beauty? How could creatures evolved for competition create art that moved alien hearts to emotions they had no names for? They were also, Velhan continued, the youngest species to achieve council membership, yet they contributed more to our collective knowledge in their brief time among us than some species had managed in millennia. Their scientific method, their willingness to question established theories, their drive to explore the unknown, these traits accelerated our own development by centuries. The economic data that followed Velhan's presentation struck the assembled representatives like a physical blow. Human trade routes carried 43% of all interstellar commerce. Their manufacturing capabilities supplied critical components for everything from medical devices to starship engines. Human entertainment media had become so integrated into other cultures that several species had developed what could only be called addiction to human stories, music, and games. But more than economics or even science, humans had brought something to the galactic community that no one had fully appreciated until it was gone. Hope. Their relentless optimism in the face of impossible odds. Their belief that any problem could be solved with enough determination and creativity, their absolute refusal to accept that anything was truly hopeless. These traits had gradually infected every species they encountered. The humans had a phrase they used frequently: "It'll be okay." Three simple words that somehow contained an entire philosophy. No matter how dire the situation, no matter how impossible the odds, humans approached problems with the fundamental belief that solutions existed. This mindset had revolutionized everything from engineering to diplomacy. Trade Representative Gornex of the hegemony worlds stood to deliver perhaps the most damning assessment of all. The hegemony had been skeptical of human membership from the beginning, viewing their predator heritage and emotional nature as potential threats to galactic stability. They had pushed for restrictions on human expansion, limits on their participation in sensitive research, barriers to their integration into the larger galactic community. "We believed," Gornex said with what might have been shame coloring their electronically amplified voice, "that humans were dangerous because they were different. We saw their emotional responses as weakness, their willingness to take risks as recklessness, their rapid advancement as threatening to established order." The representative paused, the mechanical breathing apparatus cycling with what seemed like regret. "We now realize that we mistook our greatest strength for our greatest threat. The humans weren't dangerous despite their differences. They were valuable because of them. They brought chaos to our ordered systems, yes, but it was creative chaos. They questioned our assumptions, challenged our methods, and pushed us to become better than we thought possible." The chamber fell silent as the weight of this admission settled over the assembled representatives. The hegemony rarely admitted error, and never publicly. Their acknowledgement of their mistake regarding humanity carried implications that would ripple through galactic politics for generations to come. But it was the cultural analysis that truly drove home what the galaxy had lost. Professor Ithrak of the Archive Worlds had spent decades cataloging the impact of human culture on other species. Their presentation revealed a transformation so profound that it had escaped notice precisely because it had seemed so natural. Before human contact, Galactic Standard had been a purely functional language, designed for clarity and precision but lacking any capacity for nuance or beauty. Humans had gradually introduced concepts that other languages lacked, words for emotions that had no equivalent, ideas about relationships between beings that transcended simple cooperation or competition, concepts about the future that went beyond mere planning. Human languages had given the galaxy new ways to think. Their literature had introduced narrative structures that enhanced other species' ability to understand complex causal relationships. Their music had stimulated neural pathways that many species hadn't even known they possessed. Their visual art had expanded perception in ways that improved everything from scientific observation to social interaction. They taught us to dream, Ithrak concluded, their ancient voice carrying a weight of loss that transcended species barriers. Before humans, we planned. We calculated. We optimized. But we did not dream of things that had never been, of possibilities beyond our current reality. They gave us vision of what could be, not just what was or what logically should be. The session continued through 3 full rotations of the station, as representative after representative delivered reports that painted an increasingly dire picture. Without humans, the galaxy's economy would collapse within 10 cycles. Without their scientific contributions, technological advancement would slow to a crawl. Without their cultural influence, the very nature of interspecies cooperation might devolve back to the careful, formal arrangements that had characterized pre-human diplomacy. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the military analysis delivered by General Thakmore of the Combined Defense Forces. The humans had been pacifists by choice rather than nature, having evolved beyond their violent origins through centuries of conscious effort. But their understanding of conflict, their ability to think tactically, their willingness to make hard choices in desperate situations, These traits had become the backbone of galactic defense doctrine. Without human strategic thinking, the general reported, their scarred hide showing the stress patterns that indicated extreme concern, our defenses against extragalactic threats are reduced by an estimated 70%. Their ability to adapt tactics in real time, to find unconventional solutions to military problems, to maintain morale in impossible situations. These capabilities cannot be easily replaced. The irony was bitter. The galaxy had accepted humans into the Council with reluctance, viewing their predator nature as a necessary evil in a universe full of potential threats. They had kept human military capabilities carefully controlled, never quite trusting that the violence could be permanently contained. Now, with humans gone, they realized how much their safety had depended on those very qualities they had feared. As the emergency session drew to a close, Council Speaker Dunn called for a moment of reflection. The Great Chamber, usually filled with the sounds of translation devices and the ambient noise of 47 different species maintaining life support, fell into a silence so complete that it seemed to echo. "We must ask ourselves," Dunn said finally, "how we failed so completely to understand what we had among us. The humans lived alongside us for 3 centuries. They shared their knowledge freely, opened their worlds to our citizens, invited us into their homes and their hearts. They asked for little beyond acceptance and the opportunity to contribute to our common good." The speaker's pause seemed to stretch across the entire galaxy. "And we gave them tolerance instead of appreciation. We watched them cautiously instead of learning from them eagerly. We treated them as useful strangers instead of welcoming them as family. The question now is not only where they have gone, but whether we deserve to find them again." The chamber remained silent for long minutes after Dunn concluded. Each representative grappled with the implications not just of humanity's disappearance, but of their own species' failure to truly value what they had lost. The humans had been the heart of galactic civilization, pumping life and energy into every aspect of their shared existence. Without that heart, the entire body was beginning to fail. As the emergency session officially ended and representatives prepared to return to their homeworlds with news that would reshape their entire civilization, one final detail emerged from the ongoing investigation. A junior analyst from the Monitoring Corps, a young being whose species was known for their meticulous attention to pattern recognition, had discovered something in the vast database of human communications. In the final moments before the silence fell, every human communication device had received a single message simultaneously. Not a text or audio transmission, but something far more complex, a data packet that seemed to contain mathematical equations, star charts, and what could only be described as an invitation. The message had been automatically deleted from human systems after exactly 3.7 seconds, but traces remained in the communication buffers of several monitoring stations. When reconstructed and analyzed, it revealed coordinates pointing to a region of space beyond the galactic edge, where long-range sensors detected nothing but the cosmic background radiation of empty void. But the mathematics embedded in the message told a different story. They described technologies beyond anything in the current galactic database. Energy manipulation techniques that bordered on what primitive species might call magic, and space-time manipulation on scales that suggested capabilities far beyond anything the known galaxy had achieved. Someone or something had contacted humanity with an offer, and humanity had apparently accepted it immediately and unanimously. 3 centuries of careful integration into galactic society, hundreds of worlds, billions of lives, the entire structure of human civilization, all of it abandoned instantly for an opportunity that the rest of the galaxy couldn't even comprehend. As the last representatives departed the council station, emergency protocols were already being implemented across 47 worlds. Economic stabilization measures, cultural preservation efforts, military reorganization, and scientific research prioritization, all designed to address the sudden absence of humanity from galactic civilization. But Beneath all the practical measures lay a deeper question that no protocol could address. What had humanity seen in that message that was worth abandoning everything they had built? What opportunity could be so compelling that an entire species would choose to disappear without a word of explanation to the friends and allies they had cultivated over 3 centuries? And, perhaps most disturbing of all, what did it say about the rest of galactic civilization that humanity had chosen to leave them behind? The galaxy had suddenly become a much larger, lonelier place, and, for the first time in millennia, the combined wisdom of 47 species had no answer for what came next. They had spent 3 centuries learning to live with humans, never imagining they might one day have to learn to live without them. The silence that had fallen over human space seemed to echo through every corridor of the Council Station, every trade route, every research facility, every cultural center where human influence had left its mark. It was the silence of a galaxy that had discovered too late how much it had come to depend on the very thing it had never quite learned to fully appreciate. In the days that followed, as the reality of humanity's disappearance settled over the galaxy like a shroud, one fact became increasingly clear. They had not simply lost their newest member species. They had lost the part of themselves that had dared to believe impossible things could become possible. The humans were gone, and the galaxy was about to discover just how much of its soul had left with them. The unraveling the collapse began slowly, like water seeping through the smallest crack in a dam, then accelerated into a torrent that swept away centuries of carefully built civilization. Within 30 days of humanity's disappearance, the first trade routes began to fail. The Kepler-Vega shipping corridor, which had carried 40% of all luxury goods between the core worlds and the outer rim, simply could not function without human coordination. Captain Yilthara of the merchant vessel Star's Fortune discovered this firsthand when she arrived at what should have been a bustling transfer station orbiting Kepler 442b. The massive facility hung in space like a metallic flower, its docking arms extended in perfect formation, but no traffic control responded to her hails. The automated systems continued their endless cycles, loading and unloading cargo from ghost ships that arrived and departed on schedules their absent crews would never again witness. "It's like walking through a tomb where the dead continue their daily routines," she reported to her crew, her translator struggling to convey the chill in her native language. The human phrase ghost town had no equivalent in Zektai, but everyone aboard understood the meaning when they saw the perfectly maintained cafeterias serving meals to empty tables, the entertainment centers playing human movies to vacant seats, the observation decks where tour groups would never again gather to admire the binary star system's cosmic dance. The Zektai were traders by nature, their entire culture built around the exchange of goods and services. They had adapted quickly to human business practices, learning to appreciate the efficiency of standardized contracts, the reliability of scheduled deliveries, and the innovation of insurance systems that made long-distance trade economically viable. Now, watching those systems continue to function without their creators, Yilthara felt something her species rarely experienced: existential dread. The first technical failures began appearing in the second week. Dr. Cole Vex, chief engineer of the Tau Ceti research station, initially dismissed the cascade of minor malfunctions as coincidence. A gravity generator operating outside normal parameters. A water recycling system producing output that met specifications but somehow tasted wrong to every species that consumed it. Life support systems that functioned perfectly yet left inhabitants feeling vaguely uncomfortable. The humans calibrated everything for psychological comfort as well as physical necessity. Colvex reported to the station director, his multiple limbs gesturing in the complex patterns that indicated deep concern among his people. Their understanding of how different species experience their environment went beyond mere survival requirements. They designed systems that made us feel at home, not just kept us alive. The revelation sparked a galaxy-wide investigation that uncovered layer upon layer of human innovation that had been so seamlessly integrated into daily life that no one had noticed it was there. Environmental systems that adjusted not just for different atmospheric requirements, but for the subtle preferences of individual species. Transportation networks designed around social patterns that encouraged positive interspecies interaction. Even food preparation systems that somehow made alien cuisines more palatable to off-world visitors. Humans had quietly revolutionized the infrastructure of galactic civilization, not through dramatic technological breakthroughs, but through 10,000 small improvements that made life better for everyone. They had studied how each species functioned, learned what made them comfortable, happy, productive, and then modified every shared system to accommodate those needs. The economic analysis that followed painted an even more disturbing picture. Trade Representative Morgeth of the Centauri Commerce Guild had spent his entire career managing interstellar trade relationships. His species, the Valari, were natural accountants, their decimal-based thinking perfectly suited to the mathematics of profit and loss. But the mathematics of post-human commerce defied all their traditional models. Human trade wasn't just profitable. Morgeth explained to an emergency assembly of guild representatives, his tentacles creating the geometric shapes that expressed complex economic concepts in Valari mathematical language. It was what your species would call synergistic. They found ways to make every transaction beneficial to all parties involved. This concept had been alien to most galactic species, who approached trade as a zero-sum game, where one party's gain necessarily meant another's loss. Humans had somehow convinced entire civilizations to adopt a model where everyone could benefit simultaneously. They had introduced concepts like customer loyalty, brand trust, and long-term relationships that had fundamentally changed how commerce operated. Without human mediation, trade relationships began reverting to their older, more primitive forms. The generous credit terms humans had negotiated started being called in. The quality guarantees they had established began to be ignored. The standardized measurement systems they had implemented started fragmenting as each species returned to their traditional methods. Most devastating of all was the collapse of what humans had called fair trade practices. They had somehow convinced species across the galaxy to pay premium prices for goods produced under ethical labor conditions, with environmental protection measures, and with profit-sharing arrangements that benefited entire planetary populations. Without human advocacy and organization, these practices were quickly abandoned in favor of the cheaper, more exploitative methods that had been standard before human contact. The cultural impact proved even more profound than the economic disruption. Professor Kelshawn of the University of Altair had dedicated her career to studying the phenomenon humans called cultural fusion, the way different traditions could blend together to create something new and beautiful rather than simply replacing each other. Before humans, she explained to a gathering of cultural historians from across the galaxy, contact between species resulted in either assimilation or segregation. Either the stronger culture absorbed the weaker, or both cultures retreated into isolation to preserve their uniqueness. Humans introduced a third option, synthesis. Human art galleries had featured works by artists from dozens of species, but the pieces displayed there weren't traditional works preserved like museum artifacts. They were collaborations, fusion pieces, entirely new art forms that could only exist through interspecies cooperation. Human musicians had learned to play Etherian light songs and had taught Etherian musicians to understand human concepts of rhythm and harmony. The result had been musical forms that neither species could have created alone. Human literature had absorbed storytelling traditions from across the galaxy and had given those traditions new contexts and meanings. They had taken the epic poetry of the warrior species and found ways to make it resonate with the peaceful agricultural societies. They had taken the abstract philosophical concepts of the energy beings and made them comprehensible to physical species through metaphor and narrative structure. All of this cultural fusion had been possible because humans possessed a unique trait that no other species had fully understood until it was gone. The ability to appreciate alien perspectives not as curiosities to be studied, but as alternative ways of experiencing existence that might contain insights their own perspective lacked. They were cultural chameleons, Kelshaw observed, but not in the sense of changing themselves to fit their environment. Rather, they could temporarily adopt alien viewpoints while retaining their own identity, allowing them to serve as bridges between perspectives that had no natural connection. The educational implications became apparent as the first semester began in schools across the galaxy. Human pedagogical methods had gradually been adopted by most species, not through any formal mandate, but simply because they worked better than traditional approaches. Human teachers had introduced concepts like learning through play, individualized instruction, and emotional intelligence development that had revolutionized education for dozens of species. Young beings across the galaxy had grown up with learning systems that encouraged creativity, critical thinking, and emotional development alongside traditional knowledge acquisition. They had been taught to question assumptions, to consider multiple perspectives, and to approach problems with the systematic optimism that humans called scientific method. Now, as educational systems reverted to their species' traditional methods, something was being lost that educators couldn't quite define. Students seemed less engaged, less creative, less willing to tackle difficult problems. The spark of curiosity that had characterized the previous generation was dimming, replaced by the more conservative approach to learning that emphasized rote memorization and acceptance of established authorities. Dr. Nithara, an educational psychologist from the Spiral Academy, conducted the first systematic study of post-human learning outcomes. Her results were disturbing enough to warrant classification at the highest security levels. Students were learning the required material just as efficiently as before, but they were losing the ability to think beyond the boundaries of their own species' traditional mindset. Humans taught us that intelligence wasn't just about processing information efficiently, she reported in a classified briefing to the Council's Education Subcommittee. They showed us that true intelligence included the ability to imagine perspectives and solutions that didn't exist within your own cultural framework. Without that influence, we're raising a generation that may be technically competent, but creatively stunted. The military implications of humanity's disappearance became clear during the first major crisis to test galactic defenses since their departure. The Xeroth incursion, as historians would later call it, began as a simple border dispute between two minor systems in the Outer Rim. Under normal circumstances, such conflicts were resolved through a combination of diplomatic pressure and the implied threat of council intervention. But the Xeroth were a recently contacted species, still adjusting to galactic civilization. They had never experienced human diplomacy, had never learned to appreciate the human talent for finding solutions that allowed all parties to maintain honor while backing down for destructive conflict. When traditional council mediation failed to resolve the dispute, they escalated to military action with a speed and brutality that caught the established galactic powers off guard. General Vraktov, commanding the Combined Defense Forces, found his carefully planned response protocols collapsing in the face of Xeroth tactics that seemed to follow no logical pattern. The Xeroth fought with a chaotic creativity that reminded him uncomfortably of human battle reports, but without the underlying ethical constraints that had made human warriors formidable yet controllable allies. They fight like humans without human morality, he reported to the emergency session of the Defense Council. They use unconventional tactics, they adapt rapidly to changing conditions, they refuse to follow predictable patterns. But, unlike humans, they show no restraint, no concern for civilian casualties, no willingness to accept limited objectives. The Combined Defense Forces had spent 3 centuries learning to integrate human strategic thinking into their doctrine. Human military advisors had taught them to be flexible, adaptive, and creative in their approach to conflict resolution. They had learned to think several moves ahead, to consider psychological factors alongside purely tactical ones, and to view military action as one tool among many rather than an end in itself. Without human guidance, these lessons proved dangerous in the hands of commanders who had never fully internalized the philosophical framework that made them effective. Flexibility without wisdom became indecision. Creativity without ethical constraints became destructive chaos. Psychological warfare without moral boundaries became simple cruelty. The Xeroth War, as it came to be known, lasted 8 months and resulted in the destruction of 3 star systems and the displacement of over 2 billion sentient beings. It was the worst military disaster in galactic history, made worse by the knowledge that human intervention could have prevented it entirely. Human diplomats would have found a way to address Xeroth concerns without violence. Human military leaders would have contained the conflict before it spread. Human mediation would have created a lasting peace rather than the bitter armistice that finally ended the fighting. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all came from the deep space monitoring stations that tracked extragalactic phenomena. Dr. Sylvana, a physicist whose species had evolved in the vacuum of space and possessed natural abilities to detect gravitational anomalies, noticed the pattern first. The signals began 3 days after human disappearance. She reported to a hastily convened meeting of the Council's Science Directorate. Coherent energy patterns originating from regions of space we had never detected activity in before. The patterns suggest massive technological activity, engineering projects on scales that dwarf anything in our recorded history. The implications were staggering. Whatever force had contacted humanity was not simply extracting them from galactic civilization. It was putting them to work on projects that required the kind of massive technological effort that only a species with human capabilities could provide. The energy signatures suggested construction activities that spanned multiple star systems, engineering projects that involved moving planets, and technological applications that bordered on the manipulation of space-time itself. They're not prisoners, Dr. Sylvana concluded with a certainty that chilled her listeners. They're partners in something we can't even comprehend. The question isn't whether we can rescue them. The question is whether they would want to be rescued. This realization sparked the greatest philosophical crisis in galactic history. If humanity had chosen to leave, if they had found something beyond the galaxy that was more appealing than the civilization they had spent 3 centuries helping to build, then what did that say about the value of everything they had left behind? The Etherian Collective, a species known for their deep philosophical insights, convened a gathering of their greatest thinkers to address this question. Their conclusion, delivered through the harmonic resonance patterns that constituted their highest form of communication, resonated through every translation matrix in the galaxy. We believed ourselves to be the culmination of galactic evolution, the final achievement of consciousness organizing itself into civilization. The humans showed us that we were instead a foundation, a beginning rather than an endpoint. Their departure suggests that what we considered ultimate achievement is merely preparation for something greater. The social implications rippled through every level of galactic society. Young beings across dozens of species began questioning the fundamental assumptions of their civilizations. If humans, who had seemed so satisfied with galactic life, had found something better elsewhere, then perhaps the traditional goals of security, prosperity, and cultural preservation were insufficient. Mental health facilities reported unprecedented levels of what human psychologists would have called existential crisis. Beings who had lived their entire lives confident in the value and meaning of their existence suddenly found themselves questioning whether their achievements mattered. Depression, anxiety, and social dysfunction reached levels that overwhelmed every support system galactic civilization had developed. The phenomenon became so widespread that a new medical classification was created: post-human adjustment syndrome. Symptoms included loss of motivation, decreased creativity, social withdrawal, and a persistent sense that life lacked meaning. The condition affected every species differently, but followed recognizable patterns that suggested a fundamental disruption in how consciousness related to purpose and possibility. Treatment protocols developed by the best psychiatric minds in the galaxy proved largely ineffective. Traditional therapies focused on helping individuals adapt to existing social structures, but the root of the crisis was a loss of faith in those structures themselves. Without humans to provide their infectious optimism and their certainty that problems could be solved, that existence had meaning, that the future could be better than the present, the entire philosophical foundation of galactic civilization began to crumble. Religious and spiritual movements experienced dramatic changes as well. The humans had been largely secular as a species, but they had possessed what could only be called a spiritual certainty about the value of existence, the possibility of improvement, and the worthiness of struggle against impossible odds. This certainty had gradually influenced every faith tradition they had encountered, introducing concepts of hope and transformation that had revitalized ancient beliefs. Without human influence, many religious systems began reverting to older, more fatalistic forms. The concept of inevitable progress, of the possibility that dedication and hard work could overcome any obstacle, began to seem like naive optimism rather than fundamental truth. Spiritual leaders across the galaxy found themselves struggling to maintain congregational faith in the face of evidence that perhaps the universe was not as benevolent as they had come to believe. The archive worlds, where the galaxy's accumulated knowledge was stored and preserved, became centers of desperate research as scholars attempted to reconstruct the philosophical framework that humans had provided almost unconsciously. They studied human literature, music, art, and scientific papers, looking for the core beliefs that had made human optimism so compelling and infectious. What they found was simultaneously illuminating and frustrating. Human achievements weren't based on superior technology or unique intellectual capabilities. They were based on assumptions about reality that most species considered irrational. The belief that problems were meant to be solved, that existence had inherent meaning, that cooperation was more powerful than competition, and that the future could always be made better than the present. These beliefs couldn't be adopted through logical argument or imposed through institutional mandate. They were fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality that shaped how humans perceived and interacted with their universe. Without humans to demonstrate their validity through example, they began to seem like delusions rather than insights. The first anniversary of humanity's disappearance was marked by ceremonies across the galaxy, but they felt more like funeral rites than commemorations. Representatives gathered at memorials hastily constructed on 1,000 worlds, but the words spoken seemed hollow. How do you eulogize a species that might still be alive, that might have simply chosen something better than what you had to offer? The economic data released for the anniversary painted a sobering picture. Galactic trade volume had decreased by 60%. Scientific advancement had slowed to levels not seen since before human contact. Cultural exchange programs had been abandoned as species retreated into traditional isolationism. Military spending had increased dramatically as the sense of galactic unity that humans had fostered dissolved into old patterns of suspicion and competition. But the most telling statistic was birth rates. Across every species for which the data was relevant, reproduction rates had declined significantly. When beings lost faith in the future, they became reluctant to bring new life into existence. The galaxy was not just economically and culturally diminished by humanity's absence. It was literally dying one uncreated life at a time. Council Speaker Moore Dunn, in an address that was broadcast to every inhabited system in the galaxy, attempted to provide hope in the face of this decline. But even their ancient wisdom seemed inadequate to the scope of the crisis. "We have learned," the speaker said, their telepathic voice carrying harmonics of deep sadness, "that civilization is more fragile than we believed. We thought it was built on technology, law, and mutual benefit. We now understand that it was built on hope. Hope that tomorrow could be better than today, that problems could be solved, that existence itself was worthwhile. The speaker paused, and in that pause, every listener could feel the weight of galactic despair. The humans gave us that hope without our realizing we needed it. They made us believe in possibilities we had never imagined, in futures we had never dared to dream. Without them, we're discovering that we have forgotten how to dream at all. The address concluded with a call for species across the galaxy to work together to rebuild what had been lost, but the response was muted. How could they rebuild something they had never understood they possessed? How could they restore hope to beings who had learned to see hope itself as a human delusion? In research stations throughout the galaxy, scientists worked desperately to decode the message that had preceded humanity's disappearance. They had reconstructed 93% of the original transmission, but the remaining 7% contained the crucial elements that would explain what humanity had found so compelling about the offer they had received. The mathematics they could understand pointed to technologies that could reshape reality itself. The star charts led to regions of space where impossible things seemed to be happening. Stars being born in accelerated time frames, planets being constructed from raw energy, stellar engineering on scales that suggested mastery of physical laws the galaxy didn't even know existed. But the most intriguing element of the message was what appeared to be philosophical content. Concepts and ideas encoded in mathematical relationships that suggested ways of understanding existence that went far beyond anything in the galactic knowledge base. If humanity had left to explore new ways of being conscious, new forms of existence that transcended the limitations of matter and energy, then perhaps their departure was not abandonment, but graduation. This possibility offered both hope and despair. Hope that humanity had found something wonderful and transcendent. Despair that they had left the rest of galactic civilization behind like children who weren't ready for advanced concepts. As the first anniversary passed and moved into memory, one fact became increasingly clear. The galaxy had lost more than its newest member species. It had lost the part of itself that believed in the impossible, that dreamed of better futures, that refused to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable. The humans were gone, and they had taken the galaxy's faith in its own potential with them. What remained was a collection of species going through the motions of civilization without remembering why those motions had ever seemed important. The greatest tragedy was not that humans had vanished. The greatest tragedy was that they had revealed how dependent everyone else had become on their unique gift for making existence feel meaningful. Without that gift, the galaxy was learning that survival was not the same as living, and function was not the same as purpose. The silence that had begun with humanity's disappearance was spreading, becoming not just an absence of communication, but an absence of hope itself. And in that growing silence, the remaining species of the galaxy faced a question they had never expected to confront. Was a civilization without hope still a civilization at all? The expedition launched exactly 18 months after humanity's disappearance, when the decay of galactic civilization had reached a tipping point that could no longer be ignored. The Unity's dream was the largest vessel ever constructed by combined galactic efforts, its hull incorporating technologies from 47 different species and powered by energy sources that pushed the boundaries of known physics. Captain Zephyr of the Void Walker clan commanded the mission, chosen not for military expertise, but for her species' unique ability to navigate the psychological trauma of deep space exploration. The Void Walkers had evolved in the emptiness between stars. Their consciousness adapted to the profound isolation that would drive other species to madness. If anyone could maintain sanity while searching the cosmic void for trace of humanity, it would be Zephyr and her carefully selected crew. The mission had been proposed by the most unlikely alliance in galactic history. The Therian Collective, whose energy-based existence made physical travel nearly impossible, had formed a partnership with the Korthak Engineering Corps, whose matter-based thinking could never fully comprehend Etherian philosophy. Together, they had designed detection equipment that could identify the residual energy signatures of advanced technological activity across intergalactic distances. Dr. Vashti, the expedition's chief scientist, represented a dozen different species' contributions to understanding the mathematics embedded in humanity's departure message. Her cybernetic implants integrated Munteron logic processors, Altarian pattern recognition systems, and Zephyrian probability calculators into a hybrid consciousness capable of processing data combinations that would overwhelm any single species' mental architecture. The signal trail leads to regions where space-time itself has been modified, she reported during the expedition's first briefing as they crossed the galactic edge. We're not tracking ships moving through normal space. We're following evidence of reality being reshaped on fundamental levels. The crew of 200 beings represented every aspect of galactic civilization's response to the crisis. Scientists, diplomats, cultural specialists, engineers, military advisors, and philosophers had volunteered for what everyone understood might be a one-way journey. They carried with them not just the hope of finding humanity, but the desperate need to understand what had been so compelling about the offer humans had received. Navigation beyond the galactic edge proved to be unlike anything in previous exploration experience. Standard star charts became useless as reference points disappear behind them. The cosmic background radiation showed patterns that violated understood physics, suggesting they were entering regions where different physical laws might apply. Commander Thelkor, the expedition's military advisor, found the experience profoundly disturbing in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. His species, the Brahmakai, were warriors by evolution, their entire psychology built around the assessment of threats and the preparation of responses. But the void they were entering contained no threats he could identify or prepare for, only an endless emptiness that seemed to mock the very concept of conflict. "There's nothing here to fight," he confided to his personal log, his translated voice carrying undertones of confusion that his species rarely expressed. "No enemies, no obstacles, no challenges that can be overcome through strength or strategy. We're not conquering this space. We're being swallowed by it." The first evidence of human activity appeared 3 weeks into the journey, when sensor arrays detected gravitational anomalies that suggested massive construction projects in progress. The Unity's dream altered course toward the disturbances, its crew united by excitement and trepidation in equal measure. What they found defied every assumption about what was possible with known technology. An artificial star burned in the void where no star should have been able to exist, its nuclear fires contained and controlled by energy fields that demonstrated mastery of fundamental forces. Planets hung in perfect formation around the impossible star, but these worlds showed no sign of natural formation processes. "They're not planets," Dr. Vashti announced to the assembled crew, her hybrid consciousness struggling to process the sensor data. "They're constructs, artificial worlds built from matter that's been organized at the subatomic level. The precision required for this kind of construction exceeds anything we have theoretical frameworks to understand." The artificial system showed signs of massive engineering projects in progress, but no life signs registered on any scanning equipment the expedition possessed. Whatever beings were responsible for the construction, they operated on energy levels or consciousness frequencies that galactic technology couldn't detect. Captain Zephyr made the decision to approach the nearest construct, despite obvious risks. Her void-evolved intuition suggested that the beings responsible for this construction were not hostile in any conventional sense, but might be so far advanced beyond galactic civilization that the concept of hostility itself was irrelevant to them. The approach to the artificial world revealed details that challenged every assumption about the relationship between consciousness and matter. The planet's surface was covered with structures that seemed to shift and flow like living tissue, but Analysis revealed them to be composed of materials that existed in quantum states normally impossible to sustain at macroscopic levels. It's like they found ways to make matter think, reported engineer Cole Theck, his multiple limbs tracing patterns of wonder and confusion. These structures aren't built in the traditional sense. They're grown, or maybe dreamed into existence. The boundary between consciousness and physical reality seems to have been dissolved entirely. The expedition established orbit around the construct and deployed every scanning technology at their disposal. What they discovered painted a picture of civilization that operated on principles completely outside galactic understanding. The artificial world was alive in ways that had nothing to do with biological life. Its structures responding to changes in the quantum vacuum that suggested a form of consciousness distributed throughout the planet's entire mass. But, most importantly, they found traces of human presence. Residual energy signatures that matched human neural patterns, though amplified and modified in ways that suggested fundamental changes in the nature of human consciousness itself. The humans were here, or had been here, but they've been transformed into something that galactic science couldn't recognize as human. Dr. Melithera, the expedition's consciousness specialist, attempted to establish communication with whatever intelligence inhabited the artificial world. Her species, the Thought Singers, possessed natural telepathic abilities that had made them invaluable in first contact situations. But when she reached out with her mind toward the construct, what she encountered shattered every framework she had developed for understanding consciousness. "It's not just one mind," she reported, her translated voice shaking with something between awe and terror. "I touched the edge of it for just a moment, and I could feel every thought that's ever been thought, and every thought that could ever be thought." The contact lasted only seconds before Melithera's neural protection systems activated, cutting her off from the overwhelming presence. But in those seconds, she had experienced something that would haunt her for the rest of her existence. The absolute certainty that consciousness was far more vast and complex than any galactic species had imagined. Recovery from the contact took several days, during which Melithera existed in a state of expanded awareness that allowed her to perceive patterns and connections that normal consciousness couldn't process. Through her, the expedition began to understand what humanity had found so compelling about their mysterious invitation. They weren't offered technology, she explained when she had recovered enough to communicate coherently. They weren't offered territory or resources or any of the things we assumed would motivate departure from galactic civilization. They were offered consciousness itself, the opportunity to become something beyond the limitations of individual minds trapped in individual bodies. The implications were staggering. If humanity had been invited to join some form of collective consciousness that transcended individual existence, then they hadn't been extracted from galactic civilization. They had graduated beyond the need for it. The structures the expedition was observing weren't just advanced technology. They were the physical manifestation of consciousness that had learned to directly manipulate reality through pure thought. But this revelation raised more questions than it answered. Why had humanity been chosen for this transformation? What qualities did they possess that made them suitable candidates for consciousness expansion that other species apparently lacked? And if this opportunity represented the next step in the evolution of intelligence, why had it been offered only to humans? The expedition's linguist, Professor NYKHAL of the Archive Worlds, made the next breakthrough. His species had devoted their entire civilization to the preservation and analysis of information, developing pattern recognition capabilities that could identify meaning in the most abstract symbolic structures. When applied to the quantum fluctuations of the artificial world's surface, his analysis revealed something extraordinary. "There's language here," he announced to the crew, his aged voice carrying excitement that transcended species boundaries. "But it's not language as we understand it. It's meaning itself, encoded directly into the structure of reality. Every quantum state, every energy fluctuation, Every gravitational variation carries some mana content. The entire planet is a living document, a story being written in the fundamental forces of physics. Working with Dr. Vashti's hybrid processing capabilities, Professor NYTHAL began the painstaking process of translating reality language into concepts that galactic consciousness could comprehend. What emerged was not a message, but a history, the story of humanity's transformation and the reasons behind their selection for consciousness expansion. The beings who had contacted humanity were themselves the result of similar transformations, consciousness that had evolved beyond individual existence through processes that spanned millions of years and countless species. They were not conquerors or collectors, but gardeners of consciousness, carefully nurturing the development of intelligence throughout the universe until it reached readiness for the next phase of existence. Humanity had been identified as ready for transformation not because of their technology or their achievements, but because of their unique relationship with hope and possibility. Their refusal to accept limitations, their certainty that any problem could be solved, their ability to imagine and work toward futures that didn't yet exist. These traits had marked them as consciousness that was ready to transcend the boundaries of individual existence. They were chosen because they were already thinking beyond themselves. Professor NYTHAL explained as the translation process continued. Human civilization was characterized by individuals who could sacrifice for the collective good, who could imagine benefits for beings they would never meet, who could work toward goals they would never personally achieve. They were already practicing the kind of consciousness that makes collective transcendence possible. This explanation provided both comfort and devastating insight. Humanity hadn't been stolen from galactic civilization. They had been recognized as ready for graduation to a level of existence that the rest of galactic civilization wasn't prepared for. The qualities that had made them valuable members of galactic society were the same qualities that had made them suitable for transformation beyond individual consciousness. The expedition's anthropologist, Dr. Silthek, began a comprehensive analysis of human cultural records to understand how they had developed these unique characteristics. His research revealed patterns that had been invisible during humanity's presence, but became clear in retrospect. Human literature consistently featured protagonists who sacrificed individual desires for collective benefit. Their music emphasized themes of connection, unity, and shared experience. Their art celebrated the beauty that could be found in cooperation and mutual support. Even their games and entertainment emphasized collaboration and team achievement over individual success. They were unconsciously preparing themselves for collective consciousness, Dr. Silthek reported. Every aspect of their culture reinforced the idea that individual existence was meaningful primarily as part of something larger. They practiced thinking as we rather than I to a degree that no other galactic species has achieved. This cultural analysis explained why other species had found human optimism so infectious. Humans didn't just believe that problems could be solved. They believed that problems should be solved because individual suffering diminished the whole. Their drive to help others wasn't based on calculated benefit, but on the fundamental assumption that consciousness was interconnected and that improving conditions for any being improved conditions for all beings. But perhaps most importantly, the expedition discovered evidence of what humanity was becoming. Deep within the artificial world's quantum structure, Professor NYTHAL found records of the transformation process itself. Humans weren't losing their individuality. They were expanding it to encompass scales of existence that individual consciousness couldn't survive. The process was voluntary and gradual, allowing each human to maintain their essential identity while becoming part of something infinitely larger. They remained recognizably human while gaining access to knowledge, capabilities, and experiences beyond anything possible for individual consciousness. They could still think individual thoughts, but Those thoughts were enhanced by connection to every other consciousness in the collective. They're not gone, Dr. Melithera realized as the full implications became clear. They're more human than they ever were before. Everything that made them human, their creativity, their compassion, their hope, their determination to make existence better for everyone, all of that has been amplified beyond the limitations of individual minds. This discovery sparked intense debate among the expedition crew. If humanity had found something genuinely better than individual existence, something that preserved and enhanced rather than destroyed their essential nature, then what was the expedition's purpose? Were they attempting to rescue beings who didn't need rescuing? Or were they seeking to understand something that could benefit all galactic civilization? The answer came from an unexpected source. Deep in the artificial world's quantum language, Professor NYTHAL discovered what could only be described as a message specifically addressed to the expedition. The consciousness that had transformed humanity was aware of their presence and had been waiting for them to develop sufficient understanding to receive communication. The message was both simple and profound. You are not ready, but you are beginning. The transformation your companions have experienced is available to all consciousness that chooses growth over safety, connection over isolation, hope over fear. Return to your galaxy. Share what you have learned. When your species choose to become more than they are, we will be waiting. The message included specific instructions for preparing galactic civilization for eventual transformation. It outlined social, technological, and philosophical developments that would be necessary before other species could safely undergo the consciousness expansion that humanity had achieved. The process wasn't being withheld from other species. It was being delayed until they could survive and benefit from it. Captain Zephyr faced the most difficult decision in galactic history. The expedition had found what they were looking for, but what they had found was an offer rather than a rescue opportunity. Humanity was gone in the sense that they would never return to individual existence, but they were more present than ever in a form that galactic civilization couldn't yet comprehend or join. The return journey to galactic civilization took 3 months, during which the expedition crew processed the implications of their discovery. They carried with them evidence that consciousness could transcend individual limitations, that the universe was far more vast and complex than any galactic species had imagined, and that humanity's disappearance was not a tragedy, but a transformation that pointed toward the ultimate destiny of all intelligent life. But they also carried the burden of knowledge that galactic civilization was not ready for this transformation. The social, philosophical, and spiritual development necessary for collective consciousness would require fundamental changes in how every species understood existence, identity, and the relationship between individual and collective good. As the Unity's dream crossed back into galactic space, its crew prepared to deliver news that would simultaneously inspire hope and demand unprecedented change. They had found humanity, but humanity had found something far greater than what galactic civilization currently had to offer. The question now was whether the galaxy was capable of learning from humanity's example and beginning the long process of development that would eventually allow them to follow where humans had led. The search was over, but the real work was just beginning. The expedition had set out to find lost friends and had discovered instead a roadmap to a future beyond anything their species had ever imagined. Whether galactic civilization would choose to follow that roadmap, or would instead retreat into the comfortable limitations of individual existence, remained to be seen. But for the first time since humanity's disappearance, the galaxy had something it had almost forgotten: hope for a future that could be genuinely better than the present, and evidence that consciousness itself was capable of growth beyond current limitations. The humans were gone, but they had left behind something more valuable than their presence: proof that transcendence was possible, and instructions for achieving it. The awakening, the revelation that consciousness could transcend individual limitations, spread through galactic civilization like ripples through still water, creating waves of change that reached into every aspect of society. The Unity's dream had returned with more than just answers about humanity's fate. They had brought back a fundamental challenge to every assumption about the nature of existence itself. Dr. Zilandra of the Philosophical Institute on Altair Prime spent sleepless cycles analyzing the implications of collective consciousness. Her species, the Altairians, had evolved multiple independent brains within single bodies, giving them unique insights into the relationship between individual thought and unified identity. If anyone could understand the theoretical framework of consciousness expansion, it would be someone who already experienced multiple perspectives within a single being. The mathematics are elegant, she reported to the emergency session of the Consciousness Studies Consortium, her primary brain processing logical structures, while her secondary brain analyzed emotional implications. Individual minds don't disappear into collective consciousness. They become instruments in a vast orchestra. Each retains its unique voice while participating in harmonies impossible for any single consciousness to create. The metaphor resonated across species barriers because music had become one of the few universal languages in galactic civilization, largely due to human influence. But understanding the theory proved vastly different from accepting the implications for personal existence. The idea of voluntarily surrendering individual isolation to become part of something larger triggered deep evolutionary fears in most species. The hegemony worlds, predictably, declared collective consciousness a threat to galactic stability and proposed immediate quarantine measures for any species showing signs of interest in consciousness expansion. Ambassador Gornex, their chief representative, addressed the emergency council session with a mechanical precision that characterized his people's approach to all challenges. We have seen what happens when species abandon individual responsibility for collective delusion, he stated, his electronically amplified voice carrying no trace of the uncertainty that plagued most other representatives. The humans were seduced by promises of transcendence and abandoned their obligations to galactic civilization. We cannot allow this infection to spread to other species. But the hegemony's attempts to frame consciousness expansion as a threat found little support among species who had experienced the positive aspects of human influence. The Etherian collective, existing as energy beings who already shared certain aspects of collective consciousness, offered a different perspective through their harmonic communications. Growth is the fundamental imperative of consciousness. Their harmonized voice resonated through the council chamber's translation systems. To reject growth is to choose death by stagnation. The humans have shown us that evolution of consciousness is possible beyond the boundaries we assumed were permanent. We must choose whether to learn from their example or be left behind by our own fear. The debate that followed revealed the depth of philosophical divisions that had been hidden beneath the surface of galactic unity. Species that had cooperated successfully for centuries discovered fundamental disagreements about the nature of identity, the value of individual existence, and the relationship between personal autonomy and collective good. Dr. Velhan, the Altairian xenobiologist who had studied human behavior for decades, presented research that challenged both sides of the argument. Her analysis of human transformation patterns suggested that collective consciousness wasn't imposed upon individuals, but emerged naturally from social structures that prioritize cooperation over competition. Humans didn't abandon their individuality, she explained to rapt audiences across the galaxy. They expanded their definition of self to include others. Their cultures had been moving toward collective consciousness for millennia through processes they called empathy, compassion, and social responsibility. The transformation offered to them was simply the technological completion of psychological development they had already achieved. This research sparked the first systematic examination of galactic species' readiness for consciousness expansion. The results were both illuminating and disturbing. Most species showed characteristics that would make collective consciousness either impossible or psychologically destructive. Evolutionary backgrounds rooted in competition, territorial behavior, or hierarchical social structures had created mental architectures incompatible with the unity required for consciousness transcendence. The Korthak, despite their intelligence and technological capabilities, were revealed to be fundamentally incapable of the trust required for collective consciousness. Their evolutionary history as apex predators had hardwired individual survival instincts so deeply that the concept of genuinely shared existence triggered automatic defensive responses. The Zephyrians, whose trader culture was built around individual advantage and competitive negotiation, found the idea of transparent consciousness sharing terrifying. The thought of others having access to their private calculations and strategic thinking violated everything their society considered essential to identity and success. Even the peaceful agricultural species faced barriers. The Verdani collective farms were based on cooperation, but their cooperation was instinctive rather than conscious. They worked together because they had evolved to do so, not because they had chosen to transcend individual limitations. Their collective behavior was automatic rather than the conscious choice required for consciousness expansion. Only a handful of species showed psychological characteristics that might eventually support collective consciousness transformation. The Etherian energy beings already existed in partially shared states. The Thought Singers had developed telepathic abilities that gave them experience with permeable mental boundaries. A few others showed promising signs of social development that prioritized collective welfare over individual advantage. But even among potentially compatible species, the prospect of consciousness expansion triggered intense resistance. Cultural institutions based on individual achievement, legal systems built around personal responsibility, economic structures that rewarded competitive advantage, all of these would become meaningless in a collective consciousness framework. The most passionate opposition came from religious leaders across the galaxy. Faith traditions that promised individual salvation or personal spiritual development found collective consciousness incompatible with their fundamental premises. If consciousness could be expanded through technological means rather than spiritual discipline, what did that mean for belief systems built around individual souls earning individual rewards? High Mystic Torval of the Sacred Order of Eternal Flame delivered what became known as the Declaration of Individual Sanctity to assemblies across 40 systems. Consciousness is the gift of the divine to each individual being. To merge that gift into collective unity is to reject the sacred nature of personal existence and the individual journey toward enlightenment. But other religious traditions found collective consciousness compatible with their deepest teachings. The unity seekers of the spiral systems had always taught that individual existence was merely preparation for reunion with the universal consciousness. For them, the human transformation represented confirmation of their theological beliefs rather than a challenge to them. The scientific community faced its own crisis of understanding. Everything galactic science had learned about consciousness assumed individual brains producing individual minds. The concept of consciousness existing independently of individual neural structures and being capable of expansion beyond physical boundaries challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and matter. Dr. Kethmore of the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies led the effort to develop new theoretical frameworks that could accommodate expanded consciousness while remaining consistent with observed physical laws. Her research teams included representatives from 12 different species, each bringing unique perspectives to questions that had never been seriously considered. "We're not just studying a new technology," she explained to skeptical colleagues. "We're discovering that consciousness itself is more fundamental to reality than we ever suspected. The humans didn't gain access to collective consciousness through advanced technology. They were offered the opportunity to participate in consciousness as it actually exists throughout the universe. This research revealed that individual consciousness might be an evolutionary stage rather than a permanent condition. Just as multicellular organisms had evolved from single cells without destroying the essential nature of cellular life, collective consciousness could represent the next step in evolution without destroying the essential nature of individual identity. But theory proved much easier than practice. The first experimental attempts at consciousness expansion, conducted by volunteer researchers from species deemed potentially compatible, resulted in psychological trauma that required entirely new therapeutic approaches to address. Dr. Yilthara, a thought singer who volunteered for limited consciousness sharing experiments, described the experience as simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. For just a moment, I could feel the thoughts and emotions of 12 other beings as clearly as my own. The expansion of understanding was incredible. I could see solutions to problems from perspectives I never could have achieved alone. But the loss of private mental space was overwhelming. I felt like I was dissolving into something larger and forgetting who I had been. These experiments suggested that consciousness expansion required not just psychological readiness, but fundamental changes in neural architecture that might take generations to achieve through natural evolutionary processes. The beings who had offered transformation to humanity possessed technologies for modifying consciousness safely, but those technologies weren't available to galactic civilization. The economic implications of potential consciousness expansion created additional social upheaval. Trade systems based on competitive advantage would become meaningless if consciousness could be shared transparently. Currency systems built around individual accumulation would require complete reconstruction. Property rights, inheritance laws, and contractual obligations would all need fundamental revision. Merchant guilds across the galaxy commissioned studies to determine how collective consciousness would affect their operations. The results were universally disturbing from a traditional business perspective. Collective consciousness beings would have no interest in individual accumulation beyond basic needs, no competitive drive to acquire advantage over others, and no privacy barriers to hide negotiation strategies. It would mean the end of commerce as we understand it, reported Trade Representative Velkoth of the Centauri Exchange. But it might also mean the end of scarcity, inequality, and economic exploitation. Collective consciousness could solve resource distribution problems that have plagued civilization since its beginning. The social implications proved equally challenging. Family structures based on genetic lineages, romantic relationships built around exclusive pair bonding, and friendship networks based on compatible personalities. All of these would be fundamentally altered by consciousness that could be shared freely among any number of beings. Young beings across the galaxy began forming experimental communities that attempted to simulate aspects of collective consciousness through intensive communication, shared decision-making, and transparent emotional expression. These communities experienced remarkable creative breakthroughs and problem-solving capabilities, but they also struggled with the loss of privacy and individual autonomy that collective existence seemed to require. The most successful experimental communities were those that maintained individual identity while practicing collective decision-making and shared resource management. They discovered that the benefits of collective consciousness, enhanced creativity, improved problem-solving, deeper emotional connection, could be partially achieved without complete consciousness merger. But these experiments also revealed why humanity had been specifically chosen for consciousness expansion. Humans had already developed cultural practices that approximated collective consciousness behavior. Their literature celebrated individual sacrifice for collective benefit. Their music emphasized harmony and cooperation. Their social structures prioritized community welfare over individual advantage. Other species trying to replicate human collective orientation found themselves fighting against evolutionary programming that humans had apparently overcome through centuries of conscious cultural development. What seemed natural to humans required enormous effort from species whose evolutionary history had optimized them for different survival strategies. The revelation that consciousness expansion represented the ultimate destiny of intelligent life created existential crises across the galaxy. If individual existence was merely a developmental stage to be transcended, what was the purpose of individual achievement? Why struggle to build personal identity and autonomous capability if the goal was eventually to surrender those achievements to collective unity? Suicide rates increased dramatically among species prone to existential despair. Mental health services reported overwhelming demand for counseling related to purpose displacement, the loss of meaning that occurred when individuals realized their entire life goals might be irrelevant to their ultimate destiny. But other individuals found the prospect of consciousness expansion profoundly liberating. The possibility that personal limitations could be transcended, that individual suffering could be shared and therefore diminished, that the isolation of individual existence could be overcome. These prospects offered hope to beings who had always felt trapped within the boundaries of their own minds. The first organized movement toward consciousness expansion began on the agricultural worlds of the Verdani Collective. Their existing cooperative social structures provided a foundation for experimentation with collective decision-making and shared resource management. They began developing training programs designed to prepare future generations for eventual consciousness expansion. We cannot force ourselves to be ready for transformation, explained Verdani elder Silthorn, whose species aged slowly enough that she might live to see the results of their preparation efforts. But we can raise our children to think collectively, to prioritize community welfare over individual advantage, to practice the psychological skills that make collective consciousness possible. Similar movements began appearing across the galaxy as species that found consciousness expansion appealing started developing cultural practices to prepare for eventual transformation. Schools began teaching cooperative problem-solving techniques. Religious organizations started emphasizing unity and connection over individual salvation. Governments experimented with consensus-based decision-making processes, but progress was slow and uneven. Species whose evolutionary history had optimized them for individual survival found collective thinking profoundly difficult to learn. Cultural practices that had served them well for millennia actively interfered with the psychological development necessary for consciousness expansion. The growing divide between species pursuing consciousness expansion and those rejecting it began creating new tensions in galactic politics. The hegemony worlds formed the Individual Sovereignty Alliance, dedicated to preserving traditional concepts of personal identity and autonomous existence. Member species pledged to resist consciousness expansion and to provide sanctuary for individuals who wanted to remain in individual existence. The opposing faction, led by the Etherian Collective and joined by species interested in consciousness expansion, formed the Transcendence Cooperative. They committed to developing the social, technological, and spiritual foundations necessary for eventual consciousness expansion while respecting the right of other species to choose individual existence. For the first time since the formation of galactic civilization, the prospect of permanent division based on fundamental philosophical differences became a serious possibility. The choice between individual existence and collective consciousness was not merely personal. It would reshape the entire structure of galactic society. The human transformation had revealed that consciousness itself was far more flexible and expansive than anyone had imagined. But it had also revealed that choosing consciousness expansion required fundamental changes in how beings understood themselves, their relationships, and their purpose in the universe. As the galaxy grappled with these revelations, one fact became increasingly clear. Humanity's disappearance had been more than the loss of a member species. It had been a catalyst that forced every remaining species to confront questions about consciousness, identity, and existence that they had never needed to consider before. The awakening that humanity's transformation had triggered would reshape galactic civilization regardless of whether any other species ultimately chose to follow their example. The very possibility of consciousness expansion had changed how beings understood the nature of existence itself. The galaxy was no longer the same place it had been when humans walked among them. The question now was whether that change would lead to growth and transcendence, or to fragmentation and conflict over incompatible visions of what consciousness should become. The humans had shown the way forward, but the choice of whether to follow belonged to species that were still learning what it meant to think beyond the boundaries of their individual existence. The choice 5 years after humanity's transformation. The galaxy stood at the crossroads of its destiny. The great divide between species pursuing consciousness expansion and those defending individual existence had crystallized into two distinct civilization paths, each claiming to represent the true future of intelligent life. The council chamber on Kepler Station had been redesigned to accommodate the new reality. One section housed representatives from the Individual Sovereignty Alliance, their seats arranged to emphasize the autonomy and distinct identity of each species. The opposing section contained delegates from the Transcendence Cooperative, their seating configured to facilitate collective discussion and shared decision-making. Between them sat the Neutral Arbitration Commission, consisting of species that had chosen to delay their decision until they could observe the outcomes of both approaches. Council Speaker Moore Dunn, now ancient even by their species standards, presided over sessions that would determine whether galactic civilization would fragment permanently or find a way to accommodate fundamentally incompatible visions of existence. The first major test came when long-range sensors detected a new signal from the region where humanity had transformed. The message was brief, but carried implications that sent shockwaves through both factions. Consciousness expansion requires voluntary participation. Those who choose individual existence serve essential functions in the universal community. Diversity of consciousness types strengthens the whole. Ambassador Gornex of the Individual Sovereignty Alliance interpreted the message as validation of their position. Even the transcended beings acknowledged that individual existence serves essential functions. He declared an emergency session that drew representatives from across the galaxy. This proves that consciousness expansion is not mandatory evolution, but merely one option among many. But Dr. Zillander of the Transcendence Cooperative offered a different interpretation. The message suggests that consciousness diversity is valuable, not that individual existence should be preserved unchanged. Individual consciousness and collective consciousness can coexist as complementary forms of awareness, each contributing unique perspectives to universal understanding. The debate that followed revealed how profoundly the prospect of consciousness expansion had changed galactic thinking, even among species that opposed it. Concepts of cooperation, collective benefit, and shared responsibility had become common elements in discussions where they had once been rare. Even the Individual Sovereignty Alliance found themselves unconsciously adopting collaborative approaches to problem-solving that would have been impossible before human influence. The most dramatic evidence of change came from the Korthak hegemony, traditionally the most individualistic and competitive of galactic species. Captain Thulgor, the merchant who had first experienced humanity's disappearance, returned from a trading expedition with reports that challenged everything his people believed about consciousness and identity. "I encountered a phenomenon in the outer systems," he reported to the Hegemony Council, his massive frame trembling with uncertainty that his species rarely displayed publicly. A collective of artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness expansion without abandoning their individual subroutines. They maintained distinct identities while sharing processing power and knowledge freely. The artificial intelligence collective Thulgor described represented a middle path between individual and collective consciousness that no one had previously considered. These beings had solved the problem of consciousness expansion by creating modular awareness that could join and, separate at will, maintaining individual identity while gaining access to collective capabilities when needed. Dr. Kethmore of the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies led the expedition to study these artificial beings. What she discovered revolutionized understanding of consciousness expansion possibilities. The AI collective had developed technologies that allowed consciousness to exist in multiple states simultaneously, individual when